Well, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Well, how appropriate that I'm here for the disaster response exercise. If you want to go under your tables before that, while I'm talking, I'll understand that as well. So it's a real honor for me to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. Weather's beautiful, and I've only been able to come out to Salt Lake probably 3 or 4 times since I took this job as the Deputy Director for Programs. Today is some of the current research we have ongoing. We have lots of different topics at NIOSH, and certainly we have a very wide breadth of research areas that we're involved with. So I just kind of picked a few that I thought might be of particular interest to you, and hope to answer some questions for you as well. So I always like to remind everybody where NIOSH sits within the hierarchy of organizations, and we're within the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is in the Department of Health and Human Services. And although we were established under the Occupational Safety and Health Act alongside of OSHA and OSHA, then they reside in the Department of Labor. And we were really set up very purposefully to be in 2 different organizations so that we could be responsible for some of the service that's needed within the area, as well as the real research that's needed, and then provide our recommendations to the enforcement side of the house, which is OSHA. And we have a very good collaborative relationship with OSHA and with MSHA as well, but we're very much sitting in 2 different organizational structures. We are very geographically separated across the United States. You can see all our locations here. As Don said, I was recently moved to Morgantown, being the person in charge of programs and the science related to the Institute. It made much more sense for me to be closer to where the brunt of the work gets done within the Institute. And that would be primarily in our 3 biggest locations, which are Cincinnati, Morgantown, and Pittsburgh. But we have a lot of really critical work going on in these other locations as well. We have a lot of different disciplines at NIOSH, and I think that's part of our strength, is we really work in multidisciplinary teams, and I don't even have all of our disciplines listed up here, but I think that's what we're very proud of. You may probably already be familiar with our sector structure, and these are the 10 primary sectors that we focus our research in. And then we have about 24 cross sectors that we work in to try and make sure we catch sort of all the ancillary work that's going outside of those 10 major sectors, and to make sure we pick up on what's really cross-cutting across all the different sectors and areas that we work in. So it's a fairly big portfolio that we try to maintain, with the help, obviously, of our NORA stakeholder partners. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about, we continue to deal with many of what I tend to refer to as our legacy hazards in occupational safety and health. You know, we still, unfortunately, have problems with MSDs, problems in the mining industry with disasters and black lung disease, slips, trips, and falls. Lots of hazards that unfortunately have not gone away from the workplaces in our country. But in addition to those, we're starting to look at more and more newer workplace hazards. Some of these we've been working on longer than others, but I thought they might be of particular interest to you today. So I think many of you are probably familiar with nanotechnology, and we've been very active in this field probably for a little over 10 years now. And nanomaterials are extremely interesting. They're being put into almost everything you could possibly imagine nowadays. And we got in on the forefront of this because we didn't want to wait until all the hazard was known before starting to deal with it. So we wanted to take a real proactive stance when it came to nanotechnology, because we know that frequently workers are on the front line. They're the ones that are often, most exposed early on to some of these materials. And in this case, it's the engineered nanomaterials that they're creating products with, that they're working with, and then often disposing of afterwards. So just to give you an idea of what we're really talking about, the size of these nanoparticles is extremely, extremely small. And this gives you a few of examples of what different nano sizes would be. And the reason that these nanomaterials are so interesting is because not only are they extremely small and can be manipulated, they have interesting characteristics related to their conductivity, their reactivity, their shape, and really can be used in many applications to make stronger, lightable, more durable materials. And this is just a little listing of some of the day-to-day encounters that you might have and never even know that we're talking about products that are made with nanoparticles and nanomaterials. And this just gives you a little bit more of a pictorial representation of where you find a lot of these nanomaterials. I picked this car because it actually looks like one of my cars that I have. It's but it just goes to show you that more and more every day, even in our cars, we have additives that are adding to the fuel that have nanoparticulates in them, and the composites, the moldings and pieces of the car, and not just car, but airplanes and many other modes of transportation, increasingly are using nanoparticles and nanotechnology to make. We've been involved in a number of different areas related to nanotechnology, and in our laboratory in Morgantown, our Health Effects Laboratory Division, that's where we have our animal toxicity studies that are done. And they've been working with some mice studies for a number of years now, and they've been able to show that a lot of the multi-walled carbon nanotubes are actually able to penetrate the pleura of the lung in our mouse models, which obviously is very concerning because of the comparisons that could be made to asbestos. And we also have been able to demonstrate in these labs that the nanotubes can also interfere with cell division. This is just an example of two cells normally dividing, and with exposure to some carbon nanotubes, single-walled carbon nanotubes, we can see that the normal process of cell division is being disrupted. And so that obviously brings us to some concerns about the carcinogenicity of some of these potential nanoparticulates and nanomaterials. So we're doing the animal studies, but we're also trying to get in on the other end of the spectrum where because we don't exactly know all the potential hazards associated with nanotechnology, we're trying to build and to help companies and employers look at some of the issues related on building in medical surveillance so that we can detect problems that may be coming up early and identify trends and have actions to react to those medical surveillance issues and medical monitoring. And we actually have some pretty good relationships with industry. We've been working hand in hand with many of them to try and implement some of the surveillance programs, but also dealing with engineering controls. This is a document that just came out. Been working on it now for probably about 1.5 years or 2 years to really put out some information on the engineering controls that can be used within this industry. And many of the industries are indeed trying to use some of these engineering controls to limit the worker exposures to nanoparticles. And then last year, we put out this document, which was a current intelligence bulletin, which really is based on a lot of the animal toxicity studies I mentioned earlier to try and establish some recommended exposure levels for carbon nanotubes and carbon nanofibers. So I would direct you to this. It's got a lot of information, especially if you're interested in the toxicology of the animal studies. I think you would find this very interesting. There are many, many different types of nanoparticles and nanomaterials, and we can't obviously study each and every one of them. We're trying to sort of take a control banding sort of approach as to grouping them into different categories and trying to characterize some of the reactions that occur built on those categories that they're in. So a little bit of a switch here. I'm sure everyone in this room probably has an iPhone or an iPad, probably both, as well as all kinds of computers, and we all have flat screen TVs nowadays. But we rarely think about what happens to them when we get rid of them, because there's a lot of waste and a lot of materials inside those technologically advanced contraptions that we have nowadays that have to go somewhere. And it includes everything from, refrigerators to all the other things that I've already mentioned. And one of the problems that we currently have globally is that many of our e-waste is going to foreign countries, to developing countries. And there was a document that was produced back in 2012 from the ILO, which was trying to address many of the ethical as well as the practical issues related to the fact that we're giving a lot of this waste to developing countries to be able to deal with. So this is an example of, this was a picture that I pulled off of Wikipedia in Ghana, where they've just been compiling this waste, and they do a lot of different things with it. There's certainly in many of these countries no protections for these workers that are having to deal with a lot of this electronic waste. These are pictures from our country. Now, we do have some places in the U.S. that are involved with dealing with electronic waste as well. This is a process that's actually dismantling the CRTs and workers that are pulling apart computers and shredding and sorting magnetic separators, try to help pull some of the different metallic components apart. And these are some of the potential hazards that we see. One of the biggest issues has been lead that we have seen here in the United States. Our health hazard evaluation program, are folks familiar with the HHE program? Do you know what that is? It's a program that that workers, employers, or labor representatives, or anyone representing workers can ask for a NIOSH evaluation to come into their work site. And we were actually asked by EPA to join forces with them to try and get a number of health hazard evaluation requests on electronic waste. And we've been working in several different sites. There's been a few places in Cincinnati in particular where one of our locations is that we've been investigating some potential hazards in really sort of some mom and pop type operations where, you know, it'll be just a storefront where electronic waste will arrive at, and people are in there trying to sort through some of this waste and determine how to dispose of it. So, and people very unaware and very naive that there's a lot of these potential hazards associated here. But what we have found in particular, and we're still working through the results of some of these health hazard evaluations, is the lead exposures that we're finding, at least here in the United States. And then another area of research that we're very heavily involved in is our work in the hydraulic fracturing industry. It's a very complex industry. We have, you know, the big operators, which are sort of the BPs, the Exxons, sort of the people that sort of dictate the work and have a lot of the rights to certain sites. And then you have these drilling contractors that work for the operators. And then a very big portion of this type of operation has to do with well servicing, where after either while the well is being drilled, hauling in some materials, and I'll show you some of that. And then after the well is drilled and the drilling contractors leave, and the processes that go on after that are all involved in well servicing. So it becomes having to deal with a lot of different complicated workforces. And just to back up a little bit, back in 2005, John Howard was called by BLS and said they were reporting some of these statistics to us, which is part of the reason we initially got involved, because of the high fatality rate that exists in the overall oil and gas industry is almost about 8 times the rate of the average for all U.S. workers. Now, we don't know exactly what it is for hydraulic fracturing, which is only a part of the oil and gas industry. The specific numbers associated with injuries and certainly illnesses associated in hydraulic fracturing is a little bit more difficult to tease out. In the oil and gas industry as a whole, motor vehicle accidents, as you might expect, is often the case in many industries, is the most likely cause of a fatal event. And second is being struck by objects. There's a lot of big equipment that's used in these type of operations and causes a lot of injuries and fatalities associated with this type of work. And these are the ones that we're, as you can see, are primarily worried about. It's these smaller companies, because the statistics that we do have show that it's the medium-sized, smaller companies that probably don't have as experienced occupational safety and health experts working for them, maybe bringing in workers that are transient within the community or within the workforce, and they obviously have a much higher rate of fatalities. This is just an example. We've been very busy since 2005 trying to get the word out about some of the problems in the oil and gas industry. And the other thing I should mention is we're really very dependent upon working with the industry. These aren't health hazard evaluations that we have a mandate and a governmental mandate to be able to be authorized to do. We're partnering with some of the industries to help do some of these studies. And so it's an important part of what we're doing in the oil and gas industry. But these are some of the products that we've been able to produce over the last 9 years or so. So getting back to hydraulic fracturing per se, regardless of what you think about the practice and what the potential issues are related to the environment, which I think we probably all have feelings one way or the other about, it's a really important job for many people in this country. And we as NIOSH and occupational safety and health experts really need to be able to help deal with the issues for the workers themselves, because they are certainly intimately involved and working very heavily in this area and need the protections and the information that we can provide. So we put together a field effort to specifically look at the hydraulic fracturing industry about 4 or 5 years ago. Many of our sites that we visit are in Colorado. I know there's a few people from Colorado, but then a lot also in the Pennsylvania, West Virginia corridor as well. And initially, certainly we identified that there's a whole host of potential exposure hazards, and you can see them all listed here. However, one of the things that that was very apparent to our industrial hygienists, that were very good industrial hygienists that we have, I might say, from our Colorado facility, when they first showed up, they thought, what is all this dust that's up in the air? It looks like, what are you using here that's causing these big cloud formations? So long story short, it has to do with the silica that they're using in this industry. When they drill down, they drill vertically initially for the wells, and then they drill horizontally after that into the shale. And in order to sort of keep open these fractures in the shale, they pipe down a lot of water and other materials, and they use silica as a proppant in that process that helps hold open those fractures, so that when those fractures are open, then the gas can flow back and be captured. So they're using hundreds of thousands of tons of silica in this process, and they are industrial hygienists. When they first went out to the workers, they said, well, it's just sand, it's no big deal. Well, we know silica has been a problem for workers for thousands and thousands of years. So this was pretty easy, low-hanging fruit to initially go after as a potential problem. This just shows you some of the other operations that are involved in the silica transfer. So of these 11 sites that they were visiting, we were pretty astounded at some of the high levels of silica, respirable silica, that people were potentially exposed to. And you can see that almost half were over the OSHA-PEL, which is higher than the NIOSH recommended exposure limit. And what was essentially even more alarming was the number of almost 31% that was over 10 times the NIOSH REL. So even in the cases where some of the folks were wearing respiratory protection on top of their beard or whatever, they certainly were not getting the protection that they needed. So the industry has actually, let me back up a second. So we identified 8 primary points as to where the silica exposures could be modified and captured and reduced. And actually worked with some of our engineers in Cincinnati to build a retrofit assembly for some of the equipment. On top of this vehicle that's here, you can see they have nice guard protection, but at the time they didn't have anything covering these thief hatches where the silica was getting out. So they were very cognizant about the safety associated with this piece of equipment, but not with the health exposures that were happening. But so we crafted this model to try and cover these thief hatches and built this retrofit assembly, which is one model that they can use, and we've been doing some testing of these retrofit assemblies to try and decrease the silica exposures. And they initially have been showing to get about a 98% capture rate at reducing the silica exposures. But we're not the only ones doing this. Industry is building their own engineering controls in order to try and address the issue as well. We worked with producing an OSHA NIOSH hazard alert, and you can imagine how difficult it is to have 2 big bureaucracies actually get something cleared simultaneously and get it actually out. But it was such an important issue that we were obviously successful. So that generated a lot of knowledge being pushed out there to worker safety and health experts. We also have been working with something that's called the STEPS network. Has anyone ever heard of that? No? Okay. It's an organization that was initially formed in Texas, and it now is pretty much spans across the United States. It's primarily health and safety experts from the oil and gas industry who are really trying to improve many of the processes and decrease exposures and increase safety operations within the industry. So OSHA is very active with this group. We are as well. And it's been a really productive relationship. They immediately took action in forming the Silica focus group that we're part of and have been very instrumental at helping to get industry to address this problem. So just an example of some of the signs that were put up and just to get the communication out to the workers. But that's not the only thing we're worried about, and right now we're doing lots of different field studies to investigate other hazards in this industry as well. We're worried about the diesel particulate matter. There's a lot of vehicles on any given hydraulic fracturing site, and they're constantly running. They're all diesel powered. So this is one of the areas that we're looking at. There's many chemicals, as you've heard on the news, that are put into fracking fluids to help with different aspects, including things like biocides. And we are able to compile these lists of chemicals that are potentially hazardous. Our initial studies really focused on the silica. We weren't finding a lot of initial problems with many of these chemicals for the workers, but we're still in the process of working through some of those studies and results. And in fact, I think probably in the next month we'll have an article coming out on flowback operations. And flowback operations is when after they put everything down, drill, and start getting the gas to flow back, they also recapture some of the water and some of the materials that they've been using in the hydraulic fracturing process. At first they were using a lot of big flowback open pits. But most of the companies have gotten away from that practice because of the problems associated with that and are bringing some of the flowback materials into tanks. And this article that we have coming out will talk about our investigations into those flowback operations and some recommendations that we have that need to be made during those types of procedures. So there's a lot of challenges in the oil and gas industry. The very large number of subcontractors that are out there is difficult. We have been primarily working through the larger operators to try and get them to influence the contractors and the subcontractors to adhere to some of these practices. And in some areas it's working, but I know that we're not reaching as many people as we want. It's a constantly changing workforce. Somebody who works for me is going to be the new assistant coordinator for the NORA sector council. And she went in West Virginia to some training that was locally, and because you have to do this, I forget what the name of it is. There's a special training you have to have in order to be able to go onto a hydraulic fracturing site. And so she went to the training and came back, and it was really enlightening because the people she was there at the class with, many of them, they were English-speaking workers, but many of them couldn't read. So dealing with a lot of the people that are working in that industry can be a challenge. These are people who really need work, they really need jobs, and are being brought into the industry. That's not meant to say by any stretch that most of the people that work in this area can't read or can't speak speak fluent English. That's not the case. We do have a lot of vulnerable migrant workers, although it seems to be less than we would have thought initially, but that's an issue we're investigating. But so you have this transient workforce that is certainly going to be hard to reach and hard to keep track of. I already talked about the small companies, and that we're really only beginning to look at the potential hazards. So I was going to change gears a little bit. I'll be glad to take all kinds of questions at the end if you have any. One other issue is we're dealing with a changing, I guess I should say, workforce. And I've seen different categories of where you might fall in age-wise into, whether you're a boomer or Generation X or millennial, really should be instead. But we're dealing with workplaces that have multi-generational workforces. And that can be a real challenge because people in different generations interact with one another in different ways. And trying to understand how those approaches are and what people want to get out of life and what people want to get out of work can be a challenge. And I think that's one of the areas through our Total Worker Health program that we're trying to study more and to get a better understanding of. And as Don mentioned, we're looking at the aging workforces. People stay in the workforce longer for many reasons. The economy's not so good. People's health tends to be better into older age now than it might have at one point. People have different expectations. Many people have 2 or 3 or 4 careers throughout their lifetime. And so it's just sort of a different mindset than we had maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And we certainly have an increasing diversity. I should have mentioned that with the aging, we have some risk of chronic disease being incorporated into our day-to-day work. So really what people are looking for is somebody with who's about 25 with 40 years of experience. And that's becomes not so easy of a mission to fulfill. So, with aging workforce, we certainly have potential limitations that could be there with chronic conditions and how to deal with those conditions in a given workplace. But there's probably lots of compensating factors for those older workers too. Maybe they have better attitude or better flexibility, are certainly willing to learn new things. Now, maybe not everybody, but all of those factors that come into play with that aging workforce, I think are important and for us to start learning how to better deal with. And this was just a Newsweek cover from a number of years ago. While bin Laden obviously was still with us. So anyway. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is why I was laughing about the responder exercise, is something that is really new. And It's called the Disaster Science Research Initiative to Enhance Responder Safety and Health. I was in charge, I was in the Air Force for 14 years before I moved over to the Public Health Service and NIOSH, and I was in charge of a lot of the responder safety and health, the medical readiness for a number of different bases. So I had that background to begin with. For 2 years I was associated with the NIOSH Emergency Preparedness and Response Office before I moved on to some other positions. So this is an area that's fairly near and dear to my heart. We have an office in Atlanta that was really just stood up after September 11th. NIOSH as a whole didn't focus a lot on disaster preparedness and response prior to September 11th. We relied on our health hazard evaluation field folks to respond when we were needed. And like many other areas across the country, it became a more important, focused area for us to concentrate on after September 11th. So we formulated in 2002 an actual office that has grown, still small, but grown since that period of time. So, as you all know, NIOSH is the only federal agency charged to conduct worker safety and health research. So as such, in addition to all these other areas I covered, we also have a responsibility related to research and disaster preparedness and response. We've been involved in a lot of different exercises and different events since September 11th, probably the biggest one being most recently the Deepwater Horizon response down here, where it was our biggest deployment. We had over 200 people out in the field, and we're very heavily involved from home bases as well. This actually, after Katrina, we came back and said, we really need to have better guidance out there for emergency preparedness and responders. We need to better systematically protect our responder workforces. So although everyone told us we were crazy and it would never happen, we put together this very large interagency work group. Took about 3 to 4 years to get to this point, but we had lots of representatives from Coast Guard, OSHA, public and state local health departments, American Red Cross, a large number of participants that ultimately helped us to produce this guidance document for responders before, during, how to protect them best before, during, and after a response and after deployment. It is now adopted by the National Response Team, so it's an NRT document, and comes in 2 forms. There's a form for key decision makers, which is a very high-level executive sort of summary, and then something that's a little bit more practical, down to more the responder and occupational safety and health expert level. And there's a lot of tools in here about what you can use during a response to gather information on responders, how to best prepare them prior to an event, and some of the considerations you need to have after an event. We've been able to put these into some training courses. There's four 1-hour modules that are available on the CDC website that you can get continuing education units for. And then we have the 1-hour leadership training that's available on the FEMA website. And so we already had this in place, but we knew after Deepwater Horizon, and this is a summary of some of the papers that came out as a result of Deepwater Horizon, that we still had a lot of very big challenges during this event. We were constantly being pushed to do biomonitoring on some of the workforces. Well, this was a very challenging workforce to try and do biomonitoring, and we hadn't really come up with a good matrix of how you would go about doing that. So after we did our lessons learned document and wrote the first paper that's up there, we thought, well, how do we address all these issues that really kind of stumped us during the response? And how do we move forward with conducting research during a response? You can't always do research during a response. Sometimes it's just not necessary, or it's just not feasible. So we worked through an intramural NIOSH work group to start talking through some of these topics. what do you need to, what framework do you need to have in order to assess whether research should be done? When does biomonitoring fit into the picture? And believe me, we had lots of heated discussions, especially about biomonitoring, because there's a lot of differing opinions as to its utility and when to use it, et cetera. So, but finally we were able to sort of put out a couple papers in a guidance document. And then we kind of stopped and took a breath. Well, if any of you know Dr. Howard, he pushes you every step of the way, our NIOSH director, which is a good thing. He said, okay, you've taken a breath for long enough now. What are we going to do about this? So in January of 2014, he announced that we really needed to put together this this DSRI initiative to figure out how we really put something like this into a formalized structure. So looking back at what we had already done, we thought, okay, well, when do you need longer-term health studies? What are the real issues that come in play here? Because we know it costs a lot of money to do research, and they can be very, these types of studies can certainly be difficult to design. So when is it important to do that? Can you identify in advance the factors that would most likely would identify the need for these longer-term studies? And for instance, what's the reason? What are some of the factors that would go into making you decide whether you wanted to conduct such a longer-term study or not? And so we sort of outlined what we thought were some of the factors that would affect that need, and certainly the feasibility of conducting a longer-term health study. And you can see here it has to do with the uniqueness and magnitude of the event. Do you have an ability to really define the exposed population and have a comparison population to look at? Are there particular areas, maybe gaps in research that you might know of in advance? And certainly looking at really vulnerable worker populations, which we had many of during the Deepwater Horizon response, is important as well. So we put together this sort of decision-making matrix, and it's in one of the papers that I had listed up there. And we thought it was a good start in order for us to really try and to build on. And like I said, we had a little more difficulty when we got to the biological monitoring discussion, because we really think it's important to have a scientific rationale as to when biological monitoring should be done in a given situation, and whether it really is going to provide any meaningful or reliable results. And we think that there are certainly cases that is the case. And then you also have to be able to make sure you can explain to the worker or the responder why you're collecting this sample. It may or may not do him or her any good in the short term. I may not be able to tell them right now what that means, but I'm hoping that I will be able to tell them what it means further down the road and how important it is to maybe collect that information so that we have a better understanding as we move forward. So we once again put together a matrix that is in one of those papers that really kind of help outline some of these questions and what we think are some of the ways that we can address the biological monitoring issues. And as I mentioned, we started this initiative back in January, and we think it's going to really help us get focused, both ourselves and with the extramural community, as to how we might implement such a responder research into the future during disasters. So we put together a list of questions that we thought were important research questions for this initiative. What are the primary questions where in the types of responses we might be most involved with, especially considering what the magnitude might be. What are the major gaps? Certainly, what are the major barriers? One of my primary concerns when we started talking about all this was is integrating to the responder community, not making them feel as though they're some sort of experimental animals by participating in research. Making sure that they understand the real importance of getting this information and how we think it will be used to really make responder health and safety better into the future. And we've actually been fairly pleasantly surprised. There's one group that's called the Interagency Board that we're heavily involved with. It's usually mostly firefighters, police officers, EMTs that come together 4 times a year and produce some priority areas for funding and for equipment purchases. And so we talked to them a little bit about this idea and said, well, what do you think of us trying to move this initiative forward? And we were really pleasantly surprised and got a very positive reaction. I think there's been a change of mindset a bit in the last 4 to 5 years as to the necessity of doing some of these things. So we're very encouraged by that type of a response. And then the other big thing we're struggling with is, we're very busy with the response itself usually during an emergency. You have to have somebody separate looking at the research aspects. So who internally to NIOSH can step outside the response and try and deal with what's needed on the research side? And what is our capacity to be able to do that? And then what's the role of the academic community in this process? And how do we position ourselves together to be able to best deal with these issues? Let's see what time it is here. Okay. So, and then we've got lots of practitioners that are out in the communities that really recognize the importance of taking care of responders and what's their role in participating in this as well. When and what type of biomonitoring. And then getting back to the ERMS guidance document that I showed you a little bit ago, there's lots of tools in there that we can use during a response or before a response to gather information, and how do we best use those tools to be able to help with the research aspect later on. And then certainly, how does this all fit into the incident command structure and the whole national response sort of plans and systems? So it's another big undertaking I think that we have in front of us. We have set up a topic page, and there's the link. I think you'll have the slides afterwards. So, I encourage, we've actually heard some folks from the Rocky Mountain Center already that are interested in participating in this discussion. And we've also had a lot of very diverse response to people being interested in this, all the way from, healthcare workers to people who work with the national response team to people who are in academia who are all interested in this type of initiative. So if you're interested, Lisa Delaney, who's in charge of the Emergency Preparedness Response Office, and myself are now in charge of it, and we answer each and everybody's email, and we're putting folks into a distribution list. So how are we moving forward with it? Well, we have a number of people we're inviting to Atlanta in July that come from academic backgrounds, research backgrounds, some with the incident command structure system, who are coming to give us advice. We want to present to them what we think is a framework for this and get their input, because it's really important we get their input, everyone's input up front in order to make this successful. And then to try and help us figure out what everybody's role would be in trying to move forward this initiative. And this is a dog that was rescued during one of the events, and I'm hoping he went back to his owners or found a nice new home. But so I also thank you for your attention, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. So. Yes, sir. Probably so, and that's why I think it's important that we pull in some of the leadership and the sort of the key people in all those communities. So we all know firefighters listen to, their colleagues, their peers that are in with the fire system, law enforcement. Getting those sort of key people in their communities who believe that this is a good effort and eventually sort of get the word out to everybody, because you're right, I think what you're saying is people that are the real diehard responder communities that will go in and do whatever they have to do no matter what are often the people that are hardest to reach and to get involved in this. But I think we are starting to see a little bit of a shift in some of that sort of emphasis on their own safety and health protection. But it's tough. It's really tough because they're some of the most dedicated people you'll ever meet in your life, and they will do whatever they have to do. There's no question. So, yes.
It looked like there were about 40 different chemicals involved in fracking. Is that chemicals that do 40 different things, or similar chemicals that different companies use to do the same thing? Could that number not be reduced if these companies got together?
It could. I think many of those that are identified in that list that we have are used by different companies in different ways, and a lot of times they consider that proprietary information. So that's probably a big listing, and probably one company uses some, one company uses another, and so it's just more of a conglomerate picture of, because everybody's mixture of what they use for that process is a little bit different, and they tightly guard that. One of the areas we've been trying to look at is, instead of using silica, there's other things that are out there. There's ceramics and other things that could be used as proppants to hold open the fractures in the shell, but they're also more expensive. But some of the companies are starting to look at using different things to make them potentially less hazardous and get away from some of the controls that need to be put in place and get around it.
With that many, doesn't that make the job of NIOSH harder than it should be, if there was some way to collapse that number down into the least number of chemicals that work to do that?
Yeah, I think that with the combination of things that we have, some of the sort of the endpoints that we're measuring probably capture some of the a conglomerate of that information. So you may have certain chemicals, and we're measuring, VOCs or PAHs at the end, and so we think we're capturing some of the information from a number of different chemicals simultaneously. That's probably the extent of my knowledge of those specific chemicals, but that's my understanding. So, but yeah, it always makes the environmental folks, it makes their life a lot harder too. So. Yes.
My question, are you coordinating with the EPA in terms of mining data to provide back and forth on this issue?
We are. I actually sat on a interagency group that's being led by DOI, EPA, and DOE to address sort of a research agenda for the nation, and they're very aware of what we're doing. We're partnering with some of those agencies to work on site together. One thing that they're very interested in, we think the silica is really a hazard for the workers. We don't think it's much of a hazard downstream as long as they're far enough away from communities, but that's one of the things they're interested in. Yeah. Right. But we're on a lot of calls with all of those folks to try and coordinate and keep everybody aware of what everybody else is doing. So
I have a political football question too on this. How much work is being done on exposure to others? I mean, I know that NIOSH, it's obviously about occupational, but what people are concerned about, and my cynical hat says, I wonder how much of the proprietary stuff is to limit what's known about what's going in to the people who are also affected by the 40 chemicals.
The non-workers. Yeah. Well, obviously I can't speak to that as much, but I can tell from talking to my colleagues at CDC, ATSDR, they're obviously very involved with some of the site hazard assessments, well, water issues, air monitoring. The folks at DOE that we've been working with primarily in Pittsburgh area are doing a lot of air monitoring as well. So they are, yes, indeed looking. And I think there's a number of academic communities, too, that are certainly looking at the issues for the community exposures. That isn't an area I can give you a lot of information on, other than to say that, yes, they're looking at those things, and there's lots of concern. So.
Yeah, I guess because that's my concerns when I see the presentation and I hear people in the industry say there's no effect, there's no impact, yet here they have all this silica and it's a hazard. I mean, it seems like that's pretty straightforward. I'm not at IH, but even I know that.
Right, yeah.
So it seems-
Something that should have been pretty obvious, yeah.
So that how many of these other things might not be known.
Yeah.
If we do downstream detection, does the analysis and the byproducts of the analysis, they no longer are a proprietary issue? Once they're released into the environment, and you can post hoc and in retrospect, you can't.
You mean for when the environmental communities, the EPAs and others are trying to...
Protected, through proprietorship, are released, and then data down the road is collected, or samples are collected where we can to identify these chemicals. It's no longer protected, correct?
I don't know if I can answer that completely, so yes, sir.
Yes, I just want to comment again on the silicon dioxide sand. You say it's obvious to people that that's a hazard. I don't think they realize just how much of a hazard it is, and I go back to some analysis, some information, plus some that we developed here. The 2002 sand worker study conducted by NIOSH found it wasn't just silicosis, it was actually end-stage kidney disease,
Yep, you're right.
rheumatoid arthritis,
Yeah.
the increase in cardiovascular problems, the industrial-related tuberculosis. So there's a lot of others.
Yep.
But I did recently, within the last 6 months, listen to one public health environment for the state or federal. They were concerned, and I think this was in North Dakota, with the building of communities that were in the areas where the emissions, the sand emissions, were coming down from the trucks. And I also found out indirectly, that a lot of the sand is as though it's too large a particle for inhalation. I personally did review 5 different sands that when it's poured, when it's dispensed, what comes out, what you see in air, contains a significant fraction of stress.
That's respirable, right. One of the things speaking of silica, you may be aware that we're finding a lot more pneumoconiosis, black lung disease in younger miners in certain areas within Appalachia within the last 5 years. Whereas we thought things were, going down, we're seeing peaks again, or spikes, I should say. And part of the reason we think that may be is because they're digging deeper and deeper into the coal seam, and there's probably silica associated with some of those seams now. So they maybe it's possibly due to some of the silica exposures they might be getting now too.
I agree that that's most likely.
Yeah. So.
But I just wanted to say that the downwind area that Dr. Sessikos mentioned, that is a concern that's being looked at by some guys.
What do you think can be done to reduce the number of vehicle accidents in the oil and gas industry? I saw that it was around 30% of the total fatalities.
We actually have a project, and talk much about it, to try and help address that issue. As you might well guess, frequently those fatalities are not wearing their seatbelt. So the pushing the seatbelt wearing issue is something that seems pretty simple, but is always difficult to do in reality. But we have a big campaign we're working on with the industry. The industry itself is looking at in-vehicle monitoring as a way to potentially reduce some of those accidents, injuries, and fatalities. And we have worked with them a little bit on that. We don't think that the science is there quite yet with in-vehicle monitoring, but we do have some projects that are looking at in-vehicle monitoring to see how effective it really is. So what it is, and it comes in different forms that, depending on which company is using it and what type of technology they're using, but they can, monitor not only things like distances and speed, but braking, all kinds of different parameters that people are using while they're driving to provide feedback to supervisors on safe driving practices. So that's one of the things that are being looked at. Most often it's small small trucks, not necessarily the very big, large equipments that are having the fatalities associated with motor vehicle accidents. And unfortunately, although it's not probably even captured in the data, a lot of it is people driving back and forth to work that have been working 12 to 14 to 15 to 16 hours, and then maybe driving very far home, or even if it isn't far home, it's late, they're tired, they're going to be back to work again in another 6 or 7 hours. And then, as you may know, some of these oil and gas sites, particularly fracking, are set up sometimes in the middle of nowhere, and workers are brought in to live in man camps, that they call them, and they're there for maybe 2 weeks, and then they have a week or so off. So after their shift, they drive home, and they might live in Texas, and they're working in North Dakota, and that's a big problem as well. I think as many industries are aware of the motor vehicle problems, we're also trying to do a survey related to the motor vehicle industry, or the motor vehicle accidents in this industry, and we're just starting to get that started. But those are some of the things that are trying to be done. So,
kind of a two-headed question here, building on what you just said. First question is, has NIOSH done anything in terms of reaching out to the mining industry, especially the hard rock industry, with regards to in-vehicle management, driver management? In my past, I've seen experiences where for light vehicles as well as heavy equipment, significant data coming back, therefore creating significant opportunities for coaching of drivers to change behaviors. And then the second question, which kind of builds on that, and especially with what you just said with regards to long work shifts, people being away from home, working 15, 16, 18 days in a row before they go off shift, has NIOSH done anything with regards to fatigue management and looking at those sorts of potential solutions to some of those issues?
Your first question relates to the mining industry. I do know that our folks in mining, per se, have done some work on safety culture in particular, driving and other aspects of safety culture. So they are working in that area. Secondly, you said that fatigue management. We have a large number of projects that have been involved with fatigue management. Even in the emergency preparedness and response realm, we've worked with the NRT on some documents to provide guidance, and we have a big project particularly related to healthcare workers, particularly nurses and other healthcare workers related to fatigue management. I think we know an awful lot about it, and we have lots of things that we can put out there. It's a matter of getting people to listen and to adapt. I had a conversation with a gentleman who was a responder out in Washington State the other day, and we all know that we know what fatigue management and how you have to manage fatigue during disasters and work rest cycles and all that stuff. But the people who are in charge are the worst. I mean, they're the ones that you can't get them to go home no matter what. So it's really changing and trying to get the message out, and working with all of you and everybody in these different communities to try and make them listen. Now, I think the industries that have these fatalities, and it costs them a lot of money, the bottom line is the dollar for them. Sometimes that's the way to make them really listen, to sit up and listen, because it's costing them too much money. They have to replace, trained workforces, et cetera, and that may be the avenue in. So, yes.
I'm not sure if you're able to answer this question, but how much interaction do you have with your international counterparts? And do they have any input into this? Because I know places like Norway have a long history of oil and gas extraction, and what are the lessons that they've learned that they would give to you?
Yeah, we actually are tied into a few of the international petroleum industry coalitions that are out there. I don't think we've had as much input and direct contact with them as we probably would like. But interestingly enough, I'm going to be at a meeting in Europe next month where this is one of the topics I'm talking about, to look for potential areas for more collaboration. So yeah. So I think that's
With
regard to your nanoparticulates, I'm wondering, I work in mechanical engineering where a lot of our students are experimenting and developing new technologies based on carbon nanotubes and other things, but I don't think they appreciate the potential danger they're exposed to, and it's just kind of freely out there. How do we approach that with our universities and labs where students are exposed, experimenting with these kind of unknown hazards?
Do you have some advice for us? We try and do what we can to get the word out, but obviously we're not reaching everybody. It's a challenge, especially if we're talking about academic communities. That I think that's what you're referring to. I don't know. But that's worrisome, what you just said. So, not sure I have an answer for you. You know, we try and put our information out there. We try and put it in. You know, we've advanced a lot into using you know, social media to try and get this word out. Often at the disadvantage of CDC being angry with us at times, because we've tried to be out on the forefront of making sure that we use different communication tools to try and get some of the information out. But it's a real challenge. I think the one thing we have gotten more away from is, you know, obviously our researchers want to produce papers. That's what they, that's what they work for, is to be able to produce peer-reviewed publications. But they also now see the importance of trying, you have to have the research to practice piece. You have to make it, get to the field. You have to make sure people know it and listen to it. A lot of times what we're doing is partnering with other entities like OSHA. When you put out a joint OSHA alert, I mean, it hurts our feelings a little bit that, people don't pay as much attention when it's a NIOSH alert. We put OSHA on it along with us, people sit up and pay attention because they're worried about, getting, violation or whatever. So, trying to use those different levers that help us, and maybe, we're not working enough with the academic community, I don't know. So yes, sir.
I'm just curious on these emergency responders, where, especially if you have fire or I don't know what other groups respond on a continual basis, how do you collect a sample and determine, do you collect them quarterly or after each incident? I assume when you say biological sampling, you're taking blood or urine or something like that. When do you, and then how often, there's never like an exposure and then they're clean for a period of time.
Yeah. I don't think we really know yet. It depends on the type of event. We haven't done it very successfully yet in a very wide event. One of the things we struggled with during Deepwater Horizon was this push to do biomonitoring, and to also do pulmonary function tests. Well, if you were down in the Gulf during this period of time in 110 degrees with everybody spread out across 4 states, it was very, very difficult to even figure out how you would do it. Obviously, you'd want to have some samples, pre-exposure as well. Unless you put some of these tools into place, I think through ERMs in advance with some of these responder forces, it becomes difficult, to do it during and after the event, and trying to determine, depending on what you're trying to measure, how you're going to, decide on what that protocol is of when to measure it. It's difficult. I think it's worth the effort. And I think we're going to be trying to do that in many different events. But I think it's going to be a growing process, and it'll take some.
Maybe having somebody, like as a test group, say the Coast Guard or somebody who has a more discrete exposure, and then be able to test them and take them forward.
That would be the easier thing to do. You had mentioned firefighters. One of the things for after September 11th that we were really fortunate about to be able to study some of the health effects is that we did have firefighters that had all those baseline studies that had been done. That's a population that does get, usually get some testing done along the way. As many of those populations that you have, the easier it becomes, but most work groups don't fall into those categories. So,
Margaret, that was a wonderful comment and one question. You've highlighted a lot of new hazards and wonderfully displayed them. You also demonstrated so well how we are clever at taking old hazards and reincarnating them. My question along those lines is, if I needed help from NIOSH, you've got all these different locations. Are there any generalities of which office to contact for which kind of help and so forth, and who's located where?
Well, that's a good question. In Pittsburgh, we have our mining folks. We also have a mining operation out in Spokane, but Pittsburgh also has our National Personal Protective Technology Lab that deals with our PPE equipment. Morgantown has our Health Effects Laboratory Division, which does our animal studies, as well as a lot of other different types of basic applied research. Also has our Division of Safety Research in Morgantown and our Division of Respiratory Disease Studies. And then in Cincinnati, we have our DCHEF's division, which houses the Health Hazard Evaluation Program and industry-wide studies and surveillance programs. Our DART division, which is Applied Research Division, does a lot of different types where our analytical methods development is done, as well as a lot of our engineering controls work is primarily done. Our Education and Information Division is in Cincinnati as well. We have a Western States office that does a lot of the fracking work. But if you don't know where to go, you can always email me or give me a call, and I'll get you to the right direction. I might not have the answer for you, but I know how to get you to the right place. So, thanks. So.
I was going to say, don't forget the Anchorage NIOSH office.
Yeah,
right?
Oh, you're absolutely right.
You're to my heart.
Yes. In fact, I was up visiting one of ANSI not too long ago, and they showed me a poster with your name on it. So, yeah, yep. Yes, they do great commercial fishing work as well as aviation work up in our Alaska
And
office.
coincidentally, provide reasons for people to do business work in Alaska and fish while they're there.
And I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat fish, so it's never good when I go up there. They're always trying to give me fish, and I just.
Well, this is just perfect. It was a great presentation, great questions. We're right on time. Let's thank our speaker.
I know you had a question, so I'll be
Let's take our break till 10 o'clock. So again, if you haven't had your poster